I am here with Stephen Almond, Executive Director, Regulatory Risk at the UK's ICO. Welcome, Stephen. It was very nice to see you again.
Good morning. Great to see you too.
Thank you for taking the time to speak to me again today. Stephen, the ICO started this year with a bit of a bang, I think. You opened what you call actually a consultation series on the intersection of generative AI and data protection, and especially how data protection law and it's phrased should apply to generative AI models. Now, that sounds to me as though you are also continuing to develop your thinking a little bit around this topic and the many questions that come to the surface when we look at how to apply some of the concepts of the GDPR to a disruptive technology like generative AI, for instance. And we have seen other data protection authorities tackle generative AI. There was this really great discussion paper from the Singapore authority last summer, for instance, where they identified 6 main risks and then discussed some of their thinking also on the issue, also, you know, leaving it a little bit to be further discussed effectively. Can you talk me through the risks the ICO identified that motivated this consultation now? And as I said, it seemed a little bit more open maybe than the preformed guidance I'm used to and I'm relying to get from you to also inform my thinking a little bit here. But can you walk me through your approach here a little bit and where we're going from here?
Sure thing. Well, look, anybody who's kind of heard me speak during 2023 when we were kind of seemingly at the height of AI fever will have heard me saying AI is not new. Data protection law has very well established concepts for dealing with some of the challenges of AI. The ICO has very well established guidance, which we have been promoting for a long period of time in relation to AI. And the organisation should really be drawing on that. And we have been engaging really closely with the market, providing clarity about kind of where we see some of the particular challenges around generative AI. So back in April last year, we set out our top 8 things that we would be hoping that developers and users of generative AI will be looking out for. But through this process over the last year, we've been listening to some of the challenges, the questions that organizations have of us about outstanding areas where actually there might be something quite novel and specific to generative AI because of particularly, for example, how it's trained on very, very large volumes of data or the sorts of purposes for which it's used, which mean that actually people still have some areas of outstanding uncertainty. So in terms of our position around AI, it's always been clear, for example, you must be in many of these use cases preparing a data protection impact assessment. Those sorts of pieces of regulatory clarity remain our position. But actually, there are some novel questions, some quite interesting head-scratching questions, frankly, around generative AI. And that's what this consultation series is all trying to explore. And it's deliberately a series, and it's deliberately very open, because what we really want to do is spark a genuine dialogue with industry, with civil society, with all stakeholders in this about actually how should we start thinking about some of these concepts in this context. So we kick off particularly right now with probably the thorniest question of all that's come our way, which is, when is it lawful to use web-scraped data to develop generative AI, based on the fact that many organizations are saying to us, well, look, it's actually not possible for us to develop these transformational innovations without use of that sort of corpus of data. We can't necessarily do it very straightforwardly or with the same impact with in-house proprietary data, as it were. We need to be able to access these sorts of data sources. So tell us what the answer is, OICO, in terms of, okay, well, how what are the sorts of things that you'll be looking for in that context? And so this consultation series is very much about starting to bring those difficult questions out into the open and say, okay, well, look, here's our initial thinking around how we would apply the law in this context. Here's, in this case, in the first consultation, here's our thinking around what it might mean to have a legitimate interest in order to undertake this sort of processing. What do you think? What do you think? Have we, have we got the balance and the understanding of the different interests and the understanding of the different controls at play right? Please tell us. So it's a little bit earlier. In the UK, you might say a little bit greener than our usual sorts of consultations, because we're genuinely really looking to get organizations not just to give us their views on our position, but actually to help co-create some of our positions and some of our very detailed thinking. So really looking to organizations to help both look, reflect, scrutinize, challenge what they're seeing from us so far, but also help us build it out so that we're ready with the next steps.
I love that, and CIPL is all about this kind of dialogue, trying to find the answers to these very complex questions together, because in our view that certainly is the only way to find practical and good answers that are that can be operationalized and that preserve the rights and create this environment that we are trying to achieve here. And I have questions, lots of them, and when we get to the answers of this first consultation, I'll come back to you for sure. But Stephen, this is a series of consultations as well. And do you already know what the next questions will be? What can we expect, in the series, and how long will this run in your view?
So, as I say, the first one is all looking about the lawful basis, but then the subsequent consultations will treat different concepts, and we've highlighted some of those concepts. So we know that organizations still have more questions for us about what purpose limitation means in the context of models that might be used in quite a generalized way, that they have questions around how far information rights should go, right, such as your right to be forgotten, as it were, and how much that should translate into this context. They also have questions around what accuracy might mean in the context of Gen AI outputs. So we know that these are questions, novel questions, very specific to generative AI, that we're going to need to explore and tease out. But we're also saying, actually, we don't quite know when this series may end, because we are very open to organizations saying to us, actually, well, now, based on what we've seen from you around purpose limitation, for example, or you're thinking around legitimate interest, we know now that you're expecting us to build in more safeguards in terms of security or other measures in order to show that we've got control. Well, what sorts of controls are you expecting to be in place? So we're very open to, if organizations have further questions off the back of this series, please don't just send us your views on the consultations themselves, but send us the questions that you're hoping that we'll start to answer next. And we'll try and answer those and engage on those in a very broad and open way. That's fantastic. It's also a bit of a call to action to CIPL members to come forward and pose your question. I think that's exemplary. One thing that I certainly hope we will see in there is to what extent pets, for instance, play into some of the answers to all these questions. We are certainly going to see come out, we are working on our next vertical on pets there, and we're specifically looking at pets and AI. So I'm really curious to see what the ICO does, because you were first out the gate there, and so that's what I'm working on. So that is really interesting to me what will come out. But moving on,
the UK government's response to their AI white paper consultation was just released. And it contains also several initiatives involving what they call key regulators. So for one, a steering committee, I think they mean you, Stephen, a steering committee, with government representatives and key regulators to support knowledge exchange and coordination on AI governance, as it's called. And then a multi-agency advisory service delivered by or through the DRCF. That is meant to start, I think, also this spring, right? And this reminded me a little bit of the ICO's innovation service that we talked about a while ago. Can you elaborate on these a little bit, and to the extent that this is already hammered out, and especially also the role of the ICO in all of this?
Yes, absolutely. So as you know, in the UK, the government has gone down a slightly different path compared to some counterparts in terms of its approach to regulating AI. Said that rather than create a kind of a one-size-fits-all AI-specific regulatory regime, actually, given that lots of the risks and challenges in relation to AI are very context-specific, it will rely on existing regulators and build on those regulators to deliver its regulation of AI, making sure that they're tackling the right risks in their sectors or in their contexts. But that is going to rely on great coordination amongst the regulators. So there's a lot of emphasis right now in the UK on actually how do we make sure that we do have this seamless join up across the regulatory landscape. And the initiatives that you highlight there really are just sort of different aspects of that question. So, for example, the government has been very clear that actually we have to have a kind of a cross economy view of some of the risks and challenges of AI. But of course, if we're going to do that, you're going to need input. An objective analysis from all of the regulators involved. And you're going to need the regulators to, frankly, take ownership of the risks in their area. So the functions that the government's exploring around creating those cross-cutting mechanisms to make sure that we're all joined up are really aimed at ensuring that we're all surfacing those conversations. We're all actively spotting where we need to join up to close off risks, particularly where there might be either a gap or some tensions between regulatory regimes, to make sure that there is that joined up, coherent approach to governance of AI. And that's very much something, if you're going to empower regulators and say, okay, look, we want the regulators to be tackling the AI risks in their space and seizing, frankly, the AI opportunities, then actually we need to create structures that empower the regulators to work together. So it's very much being explored at this point in time as something where the regulators need to not just be steered by government, but actually they need to be kind of co-creating some of the direction of travel around that. That brings me on.
Sorry, no, go ahead. I just, what you said, that the cross economy analysis, I think that's a really important point, because also here in the EU, of course, we have the digital strategy. And I also find it really important that regulators zoom out and look at, not just their corner of the world, so to speak, but look at this in context. So I made a note of that. I think that's a really important point you mentioned. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You can see it all over the place. For example, if we talk about questions of bias and discrimination, then yes, there is a huge role that we as the data protection regulator have to play. But actually, and particularly in certain contexts, we have to work really closely with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission in respect of questions of how that plays out into discrimination, and make sure that we have a joined up approach to these concepts. There's no point treating fairness and discrimination as entirely separate things that should never be approached together. And that's why, for example, you have the ICO and the EHRC in the UK running the Fairness Innovation Challenge together with government to actually generate solutions to some of the challenges of how to understand and identify sort of bias and discrimination challenges and tackle those. But
yeah, and you also mentioned the understanding the opportunities of it. You look at the risk together, you define it together, and make sure, as you say, it joins up. And then also look at, well, what happens if we don't do this? What are the opportunities? And you talk to your regulatory colleagues on that, which I think is very important. And CIPL is a big supporter of these kind of regulatory innovation cooperation initiatives, and I love that they are sort of popping up more frequently in other countries, in Germany now as well. The Digital Cluster Bonn, interesting title, but I love the initiative. So yeah.
yes, the if I may, the piece around the what we're calling the DRCF AI and Digital Hub, which is this, as you say, this multi-agency advice service for innovators who've got questions that are actually going to straddle multiple regulatory regimes, is I think going to be the jewel in the crown of all of this, because actually this is where we're putting this into practice. It's not regulators talking behind closed doors amongst themselves about how to get the coordination right, but it's actually us responding jointly to queries that are coming in and making sure that organizations are able to, where they have questions around how, for example, both the ICO and Ofcom, as the online safety regulator, will approach AI in content moderation, for example. They want to see a joined up answer from us. They'll get a joined up answer back rather than having to reconcile two different regulators' responses. And I think that's really going to create an engine for us to continue to work together in this space.
No, I think that's fantastic. And that's why I said it sort of reminded me a bit of your innovation advice service, except zoomed out and with more, advisors, so to speak, and then focused on AI. I think that's an excellent. I think this will be very practical, as you say, for innovators, and I think it will be a huge push forward for those grappling with those last issues and that they need answers to before they push play. So amazing. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
I will be back with more questions soon. This is a topic where we all have many questions, and as you say, we all are evolving our thinking around it. And as we do so, more questions undoubtedly pop up. So I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue and to speak to you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.